What's going on, Habibis? It's Keeping It Halal for Monday, July 6th. I'm Siraj Hashmi. I want to talk about fair weather fans. You know, the type of fans that in sports, for those who don't really follow sports, a fair weather fan is basically someone who cheers for a particular team when they're hot, when they're doing their best, they're performing so well, they're making the playoffs, they're probably gonna make the championship or the final. Most likely could win the championship. And then, when everything goes to shit, say the team goes into a rebuilding phase and they then start tanking to try to get better draft picks. Those fans are nowhere to be found. Those times are tough when teams are simply just trying to figure out certain things, and you know they oftentimes lose a lot. They often don't make the playoffs, or they just have no success whatsoever. Constant turnover of players, of coaches. Fair weather fans. You've seen them. Fair weather, when the fair's nice, they're out there. When it's not, they're gone, nowhere to be found. That's kind of what we're seeing right now in America, just as a whole. And it's interesting because you get this on both sides. You get people who are fair weather fans of the United States who aren't proud to be American, depending on the person who's in office. Right now, with President Trump being the head of state, being the commander in chief, you're seeing a lot of liberals and progressives who simply don't care for the United States of America. And as a result, with cancel culture being rampant, it only makes sense that the next thing or next entity to get canceled would be America. Coming off of the 4th of July weekend, there's been a lot of mixed emotions, a lot of mixed sentiment about America's independence from the British. For certainly some of the most vocal critics of Trump, it's no longer cool to celebrate America. And that has been a sentiment that's been widespread throughout some of these woke circles, these woke leftist circles, where independence from the British was really about freedom for white men. And I always think of this James Baldwin quote. James Baldwin, the playwright, the essayist, the novelist, one of the more esteemed scholars on race relations in the last century. Agree or disagree with him. I mean, I'm sure he's made some valid points. I certainly think this is one really good point that he's made that's on a whole is pretty bipartisan. And he says, "I love America more than any other country in this world, and exactly for this reason, I insist the right to criticize her perpetually." America is not a perfect nation. 244 years after the country was established, July 4th, 1776, Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That line is constantly cited as a point of praise and condemnation. And by 2020 standards, that particular line, specifically the word men, has a lot of emphasis on white men today. And somehow being proud of the founding of this nation, being patriotic is now synonymous with being, or at least not, if not being, at least being sympathetic to being a white supremacist. Colin Kaepernick, the former San Francisco 49ers quarterback, He had some strong words on our nation's Independence Day, tweeting out this: Black people have been dehumanized, brutalized, criminalized, and terrorized by America for centuries and are expected to join your commemoration of independence while you enslaved our ancestors. We reject your celebration of white supremacy and look forward to liberation for all. Interestingly enough, back in 2011 and 2012, we can at least see Colin Kaepernick celebrating the 4th of July like pretty much a normal patriotic American. And he wrote in 2011, "Happy 4th of July, everyone. I hope everyone has a blessed day." In 2012, he wrote, "Hope everyone has a blessed 4th. As for me, I'm on that workout flow first." Meanwhile, you have Tiffany Cross, who is filling in as a guest host for Joy Reid's morning show on the weekends. And this is what she had to say.
And so here we are, celebrating the birth of a nation, independence for white men, at a site described by one Native American activist as, quote, a symbol of white supremacy. Trump choosing Mount Rushmore for a 4th of July campaign stop is just like when he chose Tulsa, the site of the 1921 massacre against Black Americans, for his Juneteenth weekend rally. It's that cruel, tired, and familiar jab to Black, brown, and indigenous people that makes the shrinking MAGA voter feel as big as a 60-foot face of a colonizing slave owner.
Look, in many ways, human beings at the fundamental level are tribal and primal. They tend to see people who are outside of their either adopted or assigned groups as, say, inferior, subhuman, or even evil. That's certainly something that white people had held for people of darker skin tone for quite some time. What we're seeing now is that based on President Trump being in office and it being a very contentious period for our country when it comes to race relations, when it comes to the idea of these Confederate statues and monuments and, things that were not acceptable in the past, basically rearing its ugly head now. It only seems natural that people who've had these long-held grievances against a country that for so many years oppressed people who are not white and male and certainly weren't born here. It only seems natural that they have their moment, which there's, I don't know if you want to call it an uprising. President Trump at least seems to think it's a revolution that's trying to overthrow the American Revolution. A little bit overheated. That was from his Mount Rushmore speech. Get into that in a little bit. But in essence, this is cancel culture in a nutshell. People are trying to apply the standards of today to the standards of, say, America 244 years ago. Yes, this country isn't perfect. Yes, there's certainly a lot of progress that needs to be made to get us to where we need to be as a country and realize that, that more perfect union that we ever all imagine. And there's a lot of work to do. It's just fascinating that this is the only country, or one of the only countries, in which you could say whatever the hell you want about the country, about the government, about whoever you want, without fear of reprisal from the government. That's the beauty of America. You have the free will, you have this free speech to say whatever you want in a free and civil society and allow that discourse to take place unencumbered. Of course, you're not immune to criticism from other people, but that's what happens in a free and open society. You'll never have to worry about, say, living in a China or Russia or Iran or Venezuela or North Korea or Cuba and be able to speak out against your government or speak out against the fundamental ideals of that country or the philosophy, what have you, and not have to worry about spending time in prison or being executed or just disappearing and never seeing your loved ones again. Of course, I mean, like, sure, you want to, if you want to call President Trump a snowflake, go ahead. I mean, he certainly has pretty thin skin, but he is barred by the Constitution, by the law, from ever taking action against any of his critics. I mean, what better system is there than that? Sure, you may not agree with everything that our government does, but there are certain elements within our government, within our Constitution, that allow us to say these things and continue to restrict the power, no matter how big it gets, no matter how powerful they get. You can say these things without reprisal. Of course, we've seen presidents in the past try to silence critics. Woodrow Wilson was one of them. You know, there are presidents who didn't like the press at all. Of course, as I mentioned, Woodrow Wilson, FDR. Nixon was pretty paranoid himself. I think Dwight D. Eisenhower as well. And yeah, even Barack Obama. I mean, we've seen Obama try to target reporters and spy on them. I think Woodrow Wilson was way worse. He actually jailed journalists. And it's pretty fascinating that his name hadn't been problematic until now. But yeah, there are a lot of fair weather fans, and while they have the right to say whatever they want, and I will defend to the death their right to say it, in essence, it does. There's some truth to it. There's obviously truth to everything. I mean, when you look at, and I'll get into Mount Rushmore in a second, the ideals that our founding fathers had, they were revolutionary at the time, certainly the most progressive at the time. And if you're going to apply the standards of 2020 or the standards of today to the standards of America 244 years ago, or even 160 years ago, it takes humans quite some time to progress and evolve to understand that certain things that are in place that are problematic are wrong. It took almost 100 years for the United States to realize, as soon as it was founded in 1776 up until 1865, for slavery to be abolished. Of course, slavery existed way before the founding of the Union. It was 1619, and then you had Jim Crow. I mean, look, these are things that are, they're incredibly difficult to make amends for. I mean, you look at Mount Rushmore, for example. It is one of those things where you have two presidents who were slave owners, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It was built on the six grandfathers, the Lakota Indian tribe that considered the Black Hills in South Dakota as sacred land. America violated a lot of treaties to get to where it was and screwed over thousands upon thousands of Native Americans and Indian tribes. I don't know if there's anything that can make amends for that. I don't think there's any. There's talk about reparations. I don't even think if reparations are ever implemented, that would make amends for the the centuries of slavery that we saw here in America. But ultimately, you have to understand that there are certain things that you can't change. You can't change everything in the past. You can't erase your history as much as people are trying. There's a lot of history revisionism. From the 1619 project all the way till now, people are trying to change media in a way where things like Gone with the Wind, even where we see things like blackface being used to, say, illustrate, say, certain historical lessons. Sometimes it's used in a manner that's crude, and obviously that's not acceptable. Blackface is never not controversial. And but we've definitely gone to the point where the history revisionism is trying to dominate certain elements of society where you simply just can't rewrite history. And the reason for that is because these are things that happened. Like, if you want to talk about the Confederacy, yeah, there's a legitimate point about Confederate generals having statues and memorials and monuments, and that not being acceptable. I mean, if history is told by the victors, Confederates seem to be the only losers who've had a say in the matter about what history is being told. I think there is a widespread consensus that a lot of Confederate monuments shouldn't exist, but you see the goalposts have been constantly moved. And President Trump, as badly as he handled the Charlottesville incident, where Heather Heyer was killed by a white supremacist, and it was all over a Confederate monument of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, he made the astute point, or at least having the foresight to realize that today it's Confederate generals, tomorrow it's presidents of the United States who owned slaves, for example, like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. That was a legitimate point he made, because as soon as you move 1 inch and say the other side gives you that inch, they take a mile. Mount Rushmore has been a point of contention over the last week, and it is with great sadness that I announced that it's canceled. Not because they didn't decide to erect the face of my dog, Ernie. No, it's because President Trump decided to speak there. On July 3rd, President Trump traveled to South Dakota. He gave somewhat of an Independence Day themed message. If you haven't actually listened to the speech, it's not that bad. I mean, there are certain parts where you listen to it, you're just like, let's get that Trump spin. Sometimes it reminds you, like, holy shit, Donald Trump is actually the president of the United States. I mean, there are times where I'm like, how the hell did he become president? It's still, in many ways, still unbelievable how he did it. I mean, he honed on this new far left fascism that he says demands absolute allegiance, and that if you don't speak its language, if you don't perform its rituals, if you don't recite its mantras and follow its commandments, then you will be censored, banished, blacklisted, persecuted, and punished. Interestingly enough, whatever Trump said in that particular part of his speech isn't actually wrong. There's a lot of truth to it. There is this small but very powerful contingent on the left that's no longer interested in being open-minded. Like 10 years ago or so, at least when I was a little bit more liberal, one of the key distinctions that was being made between whether you're a liberal and a conservative, this ethos that existed among these two political philosophies, if you want to call it that, is that if you were liberal or progressive, you were considered open-minded. And that obviously you're open-minded to hearing other people's, being around people of different color, ethnicity, sexual preference, sexual orientation. And the talking point was always that conservatives are closed-minded, that they weren't willing to surround themselves with people who are different from them. And now the tables have completely reversed. My, how to turn tables. Quote Michael Scott, man, I'm such an idiot. But in essence, if you've ever had an opinion or said or done anything that is objectionable by today's standards, I'm not talking about saying the N word. Obviously, that's bad all the time. I'm not talking about like sexual harassment. That's bad all the time. I'm talking about like having views that by today's standards are considered problematic. I mean, you could look for something, just an example, just something nearly as mundane as, say, loving America or being patriotic or, loving Mount Rushmore. That's problematic by today's standards. And there is no room for progress. There is no such thing as salvation. There's only punishment. It's like a religion in and of itself. And I can tell you it's actually fascinating. Since the 2016 election, political preference, at least on dating apps, or at least what people find in a dating partner or a partner in life, what's supplanted religion is people's politics. And that's the most important thing for a majority, or at least that was the number one thing that people looked for in terms of what they find in the partner, was what were their politics. That is supplanted religion. That is huge. Politics is now more important than religion in terms of whether you decide you want to spend the rest of your life with that person. Not understanding that obviously people's politics change over the course of time. I mean, everybody has the ability to evolve and have, form new opinions, whether they be liberal, conservative, or any other part of the spectrum. That being said, you gotta listen to Trump's speech. At least, listen to the speech if you haven't already, and make up your own mind. Because if you listen to the media elite, you would never get the impression that they got. It's almost as if that they pre-wrote all of their articles and just filled it in with their particular quotes that they wanted to cherry pick from Trump. Like you have the New York Times calling it dark and divisive. So going through some parts of his speech, this is how some people in the media, this is how the media elite have framed things within Trump's speech. Okay. So you got Brian Stelter tweeting, Fox is framing the morning after Trump's dark and divisive speech at Mount Rushmore, why the New York Times was wrong to describe the speech that way. Then you have the Washington Post writing, at Mount Rushmore, Trump exploits social divisions, warns of left-wing cultural revolution in dark speech ahead of Independence Day. Then you have ABC in the tweet writing, President Trump pushes racial division, flouts virus rules at the foot of Mount Rushmore. Then you have MSNBC in the tweet calling Mount Rushmore a symbol of white supremacy, quoting a Lakota tribe member, Nick Tilson, who also went on to say, when you carve out 4 white men who were colonizers, who committed genocides against indigenous people, and for that to be okay in society today is fundamentally wrong. Then you have CNN quoting Maeve Reston, who wrote this piece. In a jaw-dropping speech that amounted to culture war bonfire, President Donald Trump used the backdrop of Mount Rushmore Friday night to frame protesters as nefarious left-wing mob that intends to end America. Then you have Dean Obeidallah, who writes, let's be clear, Trump in his speech at Mount Rushmore declared war on all those who aren't loyal to him, saying we don't love America and literally called us fascists. Trump is a dangerous, dangerous man whose 2020 campaign strategy is to inspire violence. Then the Los Angeles Times, writing, at Mount Rushmore, Trump uses 4th of July celebration to stoke a culture war. NPR, writing, on the eve of Independence Day, President Trump delivered a speech at Mount Rushmore National Memorial condemning protesters who want Confederate statues and monuments removed, as well as what he called a new far-left fascism. Then you have Aaron Rupar from Vox.com in a tweet writing, Trump offers some remarkably overheated rhetoric. Quote, there is a new far-left fascism, as I said before, that demands absolute allegiance. This left-wing cultural revolution is designed to overthrow the American Revolution. Seth Abramson, writing, opposition to Mount Rushmore has to do with the land on which it was built, not a movement to say there should be no statues of any founders anywhere. And as for those mentioning 2 statues taken down by a few randos in Portland, is that the movement Trump described? Then, of course, you have Jennifer Rubin writing, WTF. Quote, those who seek to erase our heritage want Americans to forget our pride and great dignity so that we can no longer understand ourselves or America's destiny. End quote. To which she writes, the heritage of the Confederacy? The point is, everybody seems to think that Trump was stoking the flames of at least Confederate generals and having sympathies for the Confederacy. Tammy Duckworth, senator from Illinois, seemed to hone in on that about his speech. All of them didn't have anything. And then Trump tweets this shit. Has Bubba Wallace apologized to all those great NASCAR drivers and officials who came to his aid, stood by his side, and were willing to sacrifice everything for him, only to find out that the whole thing was just another hoax? That and flag decision has caused lowest ratings ever. I don't know what is going through Trump's head in that. He's given the pass to basically all of his critics to basically say he's promoting and has sympathies for the Confederacy. It's a legitimate criticism now. He has no leg to stand on. Before, everything was, that's misguided criticism. He wasn't talking about Confederate generals. He was talking about American heritage, talking about our founding fathers. And now that's all gone to shit. I don't know what to tell you. It's very tough to try to have Trump say, it's very difficult to defend Trump for not saying that he's talking about Confederate symbols and statues and, their legacy, when he's constantly tweeting and saying stuff that seems to suggest he's supporting the Confederacy, the statues and monuments that they have. I am not a Trump defender. I am only trying to get to the truth of the matter. And that was the truth up until Trump tweeted that bullshit on Monday morning. But getting back to Mount Rushmore, if we looked at how they're characterizing it, Mount Rushmore, in 2016, Bernie Sanders traveled there. CNN did a news package on him. And this is what they had to say from that news package.
This is our country at its very best. What an incredible achievement.
Visiting Mount Rushmore today, Bernie Sanders taking in the majesty of the moment. This monument to 4 great American presidents.
Just the accomplishment and the beauty. It really does make one very proud to be an American.
Sanders has his own mountain to climb.
And this is what they had to say in the lead up to Trump's speech at Mount Rushmore.
Kicking off the Independence Day weekend, President Trump will be at Mount Rushmore, where he'll be standing in front of a monument of 2 slave owners and on land wrestled away from Native Americans, told that be focusing on the effort to, quote, tear down our country's history.
What changed from then until now? Who's in office? Who's the president of the United States? Donald Trump obviously is not your traditional Republican president. And he's certainly against the establishment, but he has pushed people on the left so far off the deep end that they're now anti-American simply to own Trump. And you have to just remember the logic in all of this, and that there really isn't any. It's whatever Trump is in favor, the left is against. And whatever Trump is pushing, they hate it. I mean, it's just nonstop. And if you got Joe Biden in the Oval Office, sure, maybe that rhetoric would tamper down. Or it might get heated up. I don't know. I don't have the power of foresight. I'm not an oracle. I'm not Nostradamus. But in essence, this is where we've gotten ourselves. Is that it's no longer okay to be proud of America or proud of its achievements while still acknowledging the fundamental flaws that still exist in our nation. That's what being a fair weather fan is all about. Is that right now, those fair weather fans of America on the left have really shown their faces. They've played their hand. They make it clear that they're not proud to be American unless they have someone they approve of running the country or promoting their agenda. In which, I mean, I'm of the belief that you can be proud of America regardless of who's in office and be proud of its achievements, so long as, of course, there are things that America has done that even in my lifetime are objectionable. And look, in spite of all that, in spite of, say, like the years of George W. Bush, who I vehemently despise as president, whether it was like the war on terror, the Patriot Act, his handling of Katrina, and a lot of things, I'm still proud to be an American. I don't think anyone should find that to be a controversial statement, but it's 2020, and I could very well be canceled for that. Anyways, Habibis, that's been all for Keeping It Halal for Monday, July 6, 2020. If you like what you listened to or heard or seen, hit the subscribe button, leave a review, 5 stars if it's iTunes or Spotify. Subscribe, hit that like button on YouTube, and I'll see you next time. Peace, Habibis.